My name is Dr. Clara Agasabo. I'm chairing today's session. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford. I'm also a fellow at the Centre for Armed Groups based in Geneva and a fellow at the Civil Wars Pathway at the University of York. My research primarily focuses on the dynamics of local order in the context of armed conflict, organised crime and infrastructural development. My areas of expertise include Colombia, Northern Ireland, and my notable publications include works on state building during armed conflict and the legacy of rebel order in Colombia. Dr. Megan A. Stewart is the first discussant for today's session. Megan is an associate professor of public policy at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Her research interests focus on explaining variation, how changes to social, economic, and political hierarchies, especially across racial, gender, class, or religious ethnic lines, are attempted and achieved, and how war political violence is often the context or consequence of such endeavours. Dr. Stewart is the author of the book titled Governing Revolution, Transformations in the Civil War. Dr. Tessa Devereaux is the second discussant for today's session. She is the Herbert Nicholas Jr. Research Fellow at New College, University of Oxford. Her research interests include civil war, gender politics, rebel governance, and state building, with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Specifically, she examines how rebel groups reshape local gender relations as a strategy of local control during conflict. She is currently working on a book project titled To Have and to Hold, The Determinants of Insurgent Gender Politics. Onyedikachi Madueke is the peer commentator for today's session. Onyedikachi is a PhD candidate at the School of Social Sciences, University of Aberdeen. One of his recent publications focused on social media use and Biafra separatist conflict in Nigeria. Last but not least, our guest speaker for today's session is Imrana Buba, who is a doctoral research fellow pursuing his PhD at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo. His research examines the unintended negative consequences of civilian self-protection during conflicts in Nigeria. Prior to starting his PhD, he spent a decade working as a community development and conflict sensitivity specialist in Nigeria for various international organizations, including USAID, International Alert, and Mercy Corps. Imrana holds an MSc in Africa and International Development from the University of Edinburgh and has been awarded the 2024 Cedric Smith Prize for Best Piece on Peace and Conflict Research by a PhD candidate, presented by the Conflict Research Society. Today, Imrana will present his ongoing PhD research titled Collective Action Capacity and Civilian Compliance in Civil War, Evidence from Nigeria. Imrana, you have 30 to 35 minutes for your presentation, followed by 5 minutes for each discussant and peer commentator to provide comments and questions. If time permits, we will then also have 15 minutes Q&A session with attendees. The screen is now yours, Imrana.
Thank you so much. So this paper is a total paper of my PhD, and the idea of this civilian compliance come from my fieldwork for a different paper. So in 2022, I conducted a fieldwork to study civilian joint task force, which is a civilian defense militia in northeastern Nigeria that emerged in response to the Boko Haram insurgency. So some communities formed the militia to fight the insurgent, and in other communities, state forces forced communities to form the militia in a way to isolate them from the Boko Haram insurgent. But when I was conducting that fieldwork, I found some communities like this small village, Gamdu, they don't form the civilian defense militia. Instead, they have this sort of tacit agreement with Boko Haram, which they call it compliance agreement. They are not ideologically like supporting the insurgent. They are not involved with the insurgent. They are not members, but they comply with them. So they provide them with intelligence information. They provide resources with the agreement that they don't attack them. So when I start to ask questions about this, compliance is something that is popular. It's not only in this small village, but also in many other communities. But then there is variation in the nature of the compliance. In some communities, they only have this agreement with Boko Haram insurgent, but in other communities, they have it with the Boko Haram insurgent. So there is variation in this compliance agreement. In some communities, they do it only with the Boko Haram insurgent, but in others, they do with both Boko Haram insurgent and state forces. So my research question, like the puzzle that I explore in the paper, is that why do some communities comply with the insurgent only, while others secretly navigate this compliance with both the insurgent and the state forces? And this puzzle is not limited to Nigeria. It happens in other civil war contexts. For example, during the Syrian civil war, there are similar dynamics. For example, in some communities like Barzeh and Homs, there is this compliance agreement, dual compliance, where they comply with both state forces and insurgent, but in other communities like Dara, they have this sole compliance. Similar in South Sudan civil war. So this is something that is not only limited to Nigeria, but we don't have a theory to explore the reasons behind this variation. So I first conceptualize the civilian compliance. There are a lot of terms that we use like to describe a relationship between civilians and insurgent. So think of civilian support, civilian collaboration, civilian cooperation. I consider civilian compliance as a better term in that it has less involvement and is basically imply like that idea of they are not formally joining the armed actors, and that they do it mostly for self-protection. They do it to secure protection from the armed actors. And I also focus on community level compliance. So individuals can comply, which is mostly what the literature on civil war show. When individuals face violence, they can adopt different self-protection strategies. They can comply with the armed actors, they can engage in resistance, they can displace. But there is also community level compliance where mostly traditional leaders, tribal leaders negotiate on behalf of the community. So I focus on this kind of community level compliance, and this is consistent with the broader literature on the civilian protective agency. So I analyze what I term sole compliance, which is complying with only one armed actor, and then dual compliance, which involves strictly complying with both state forces and the insurgent. So I focus mostly on state and insurgent. I know in civil war, there are different actors, militias aligned with the state, or other armed groups aligned with the insurgent. But here I focus on these two key actors. All other armed actors, related to those actors, I consider them to be affiliated with them. So I focus on the relationship between these two actors. I first start with the literature on civilian insurgent relationship. So most of the literature, especially the popular ones, think of Calivas, Ariona typology of cooperation, they mostly emphasize a relationship where the insurgent are dominant, they have territorial control, or whether the insurgent have similar ideological alignment with the civilians. But then there is also another literature that challenge this kind of interpretation. They explain compliance with insurgents sometimes is more of negotiation and is more of part of survival strategy. Civilians don't necessarily have to have the same ideological alignment, and the insurgent don't necessarily have territorial control. But when civilians face violence, they can decide to negotiate with them, to comply with them. So I built my argument on this second literature. So I take this compliance as a kind of civilian self-protection, especially in contested communities where the insurgent and the state forces don't have territorial control, and they are actively trying to control the communities. And that is why the civilians have this opportunity to engage in actions to secure their protection from their violence. So in all this literature, like the first one that focus on this ideological alignment or territorial control, or the other ones that focus on negotiation, there is no theory like or analysis of these varied patterns of civilian compliance that I notice in Nigeria, where you have this dual compliance or sole compliance. So I built on this to develop like the theory. And the theory, because it's a very abductive process, so I do like a mix of induction and deduction. I first mentioned that I got the inspiration of the puzzle from fieldwork for a different paper. So I built it from the fieldwork findings from the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria, but I also built on the existing literature on civil war and civilian agency. So here I highlight briefly background on the Boko Haram insurgency. So Boko Haram is a jihadi rebel group that emerged in Nigeria in the early 2000s, first as a peaceful movement, but they later become violent and engage in violence since 2009, targeting state forces. Their main goal is to replace the Nigerian constitution with their own version of Sharia system. And in 2013, civilian communities become so tired of the conflict. There is excessive counter-insurgency by the state forces, and also the insurgents were living among civilian communities. So civilian communities formed these civilian defense militias to fight them. But instead of fighting them, some communities opt for this civilian compliance that I mentioned. So I developed a theoretical argument based on this insight from the fieldwork as well as the literature on civil war and civilian agency. I argue that during conflict, civilians can take different decisions to protect themselves. They can decide to form civilian defense militia, they can flee, they can comply. But this civilian agency, this self-protection, they also relate with the capacity of the communities. This is something that the literature already established, that different communities have different capacities for collective action. So communities that have strong capacity, sometimes they can engage in violent resistance or non-violent resistance. They can also engage in neutrality. But because the concept, the context of conflict is very fluid, sometimes some actions can be successful, but the nature of the conflict dynamics can make some actions difficult. For example, neutrality sometimes is not always possible when armed actors really want you to provide information or resources. Also, resistance can provide some protection, but it can also attract like retaliatory violence. The armed actors can decide to attack. So I argue that in this context, communities that have this strong capacity, they can adopt this dual compliance, while those that have this weak capacity, which in most cases they have to engage in weak acquiescence or displacement, they can engage in sole compliance. Engaging in this sole compliance is mostly in these contested communities that are rural in nature, because people don't want to displace. Their livelihood is tied to land, so they just have to stay to engage in compliance. So if they have this strong capacity, and I operationalize this strong capacity with leadership and high social cohesion. So when they have high social cohesion or strong leadership, they will engage in dual compliance. And this I identify like the intervening variables that enable them to have this is having this strong bargaining power, because the community leaders will be able to negotiate with both the insurgent and the state forces. Also, when there is social cohesion, there is high mutual accountability. People will keep it secret. They won't tell the other party that we are also talking to another party. When the capacity is very weak, the leadership is very weak, they can only bargain with only one armed actor, because they don't have the strong bargaining power to also engage in compliance terms that the other parties will not know. And then when there is low social cohesion, the community, the civilians, the people will not also have this ability to maintain secrecy, to have the compliance with two armed actors. So they can only have this sole compliance with insurgent. And I explain briefly like how I develop like the argument, like especially the inductive part. So I draw a lot from like interviews. First, I conducted like preliminary interviews to identify like sample of communities that engage in this civilian compliance. And based on them, I selected 2 cases, and I hold a lot of alternative explanation constant in the case selection. So think of ethnicity, religion, distance to the location of the insurgent and state forces, uh, uh, their religion, all other things that in the literature we know can influence the nature of civilians' relationship with insurgent. I hold them constant in the case selection. Then subsequently, I conducted semi-structured interviews with the resident of the selected cases, but also with other like humanitarian workers, researchers, journalists in the conflict zone. And based on that, I developed like the theoretical argument and also illustrated the empirical part. So this is the summary of the cases that I mentioned and the nature of the compliance. So in Guzamala, one of the cases that I look of the strong civilian capacity, they engage in this dual compliance. And then in Marte, they engage in sole compliance and they have this also weak capacity. And in line with the theory, I show that also the strong bargaining power of the traditional and religious leaders is what actually enabled this dual compliance. They were able to comply with both Boko Haram insurgent and state forces. Also, the residents in Guzamala were able to keep it secret. They mentioned how they were able like to talk in court and to like somehow give information to both the insurgent and state forces in a safe manner without the parties knowing. In contrast, in Marte, I show that there is this weak leadership and fragmented social cohesion. And this weak social cohesion is not due to like different ethnicity or religion, but is due to lack of strong associational forms of engagement. So they don't have many community groups like in Guzamala that facilitate this kind of engagement that can enable them to have this strong cohesion. And because in Marte, most of the local leaders, the community leaders and religious leaders have displaced early in the conflict, the leaders that negotiated with the insurgent, they are very weak, so they don't have the strong bargaining power to also bargain with both sides. So the weak leadership is also not something that happened before the conflict, it's something that can happen during the conflict. So the conflict made the leaders to displace and some of them to get killed, and this made them very weak, and this influenced the nature of their response. So to conclude, I show that there are different compliance strategies with armed actors, even within the same conflict zone, also the same facing the same armed actors. And I show that the same factors that enable like neutrality or resistance can also enable compliance with armed actors. So this implication is that it's not only communities that are very weak that comply with armed actors. Sometimes communities that are strong can comply with armed actors, but they engage in different kind of compliance. They engage in compliance in a way that none of the actors can know the nature of the compliance. Also, if we are to apply this dual compliance to existing typologies of civilian response, cooperation or non-cooperation, I argue that this dual compliance is a form of non-cooperation. The fact that they provide information to both sides, they make it difficult for the insurgent to achieve their strategic aim within the community. So in a way, they are complying with them, but they are also at the same time not complying. They give information to both sides, like limiting their ability to really control the communities. And then I highlight some avenues for future research. For example, the typology can help maybe in looking at how that influence the nature of insurgent control of the communities, or also like state forces response. Also look at like maybe we can think of the long-term trajectory of the compliance. How will it affect like these civilian communities in the long term? would the armed actors get to know about the dual compliance? And if they know, how would the communities adapt to other civilian responses? So this is the presentation. I think I finished on early, so I can we can have more time to discuss. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Very efficient. I will now change it over to Megan, if you would like to take the first comments, and I would ask that you keep it to around 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to engage in some of your work. I want to start off by saying I think that this work is really important because civilian compliance is necessary, or is often conceptualized as necessary for combatants during war to succeed. So this is a really important question. What explains civilian compliance? What is the nature of compliance? And what shapes community decisions around compliance? I think these are really critical questions in research on civil wars. I also want to point out the really fantastic field work that was conducted for this project, which is excellent and engaging. So as I move forward with my set of comments, I want to begin by kind of highlighting what I thought was really excellent and exciting about this project. Jumping into some of the comments, which I hope are taken in that spirit, I began by wondering kind of what we mean when we say compliance. Sort of at the beginning of the talk, you started by mentioning some communities had mobilized against insurgents while others had not, or mobilized against certain actors while others had not. Mobilization, or the absence of mobilization, seems to be a very high bar of compliance or non-compliance, right? But then at the same time, you at the end, and I thought you brought up a very interesting point, that dual compliance, simultaneously complying, is actually non-compliance, which got me thinking, well, what do we mean when we think about compliance? Like, what does this actually entail? Is compliance, and one thought is that we might think about compliance with sort of immediate dictates to combatant control. But there's a separate question as to whether or not that is a sort of effective for the combatants in the long term. And so maybe there's a way to, like, whereas most existing work has understood compliance as if you comply, then that has long-term benefits for the overall success of the organization. What I think you're doing here is saying, sure, there might be compliance in the short term, but this doesn't necessarily have those long-term ramifications. So you're kind of breaking down that assumption, which I think is really interesting. And I would encourage you to kind of continue to push along that as you develop your conceptualization of compliance. So in terms of your key independent variable about the collective action capacity of the communities, one thing that I always struggle with is when the key independent variable is capacity, because I think it's really difficult to know capacity a priori, so before something has happened. So if I were to say, just based off the information, you can't know what capacity is, how would you evaluate capacity of a community? I still wouldn't be sure from your presentation, from your presentation. And so I wondered if you could spend a little bit more time thinking about like what capacity actually entails. And additionally, I actually didn't think you needed to talk about collective action capacity because you already identified the key components. Like, I would actually consider sort of taking that out, because to me, your two key variables are leader bargaining power vis-a-vis combatants, and the accountability among community members. These are the two factors that are driving it. You could completely eliminate collective action capacity and still just use these two terms and you get to the exact same place. So I would, like, for the cantankerous reviewer that is me, who is like, what is capacity? How can we know it? You can slip right past and completely ignore that. On that end, in your presentation, you have two outcomes: comply and like dual compliance or not. But if you have two variables with two dimensions, you actually have four different outcomes. So you have low accountability, low bargaining power, and high accountability, high bargaining power. But what about high accountability, low bargaining power, or low accountability, high bargaining power. What does that look like? What sort of compliance strategies would fall into those buckets and those categories? I also wanted to know what the civilian logics are for, like, what's the constellation of compliance strategies, and what are the civilian logics for participating in them. So when you were saying, dual compliance is this thing where they actually don't help either side, but that seemed to me to be extraordinarily risky. Like, if both sides figured out, you would be in a high level of danger. So why is it that communities would participate in something like that, right? To me, that seems extremely risky. So I would be really excited for you to say, here are the range of compliance strategies that we can think about, and here's why some civilians would like, here's why a civilian might do it, but here are the drawbacks for doing it, or a community might do it, but it has these drawbacks. And then try and place it on a 2x2 of high low accountability, high low bargaining power, and see where it might get you. That would be me if I were you. But I would, like, all that said, this was in a brief, concise 15-minute presentation. This was a lot of excellent work to, like, dig into. So thank you for sharing it with me. And I hope I'll leave it there, and hopefully this sets us up well for some nice discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. If Tessa, do you want to jump in now?
Yes, I will. Yeah. So thanks so much, Imrana. I'm already a big fan of this project and your work in general already. So it's really great to see how it's developing and strengthening. And as Megan mentioned, it's such a kind of critical research question as well. So one thing I really liked that I hadn't seen before in your work was this kind of emphasis on this risk of betrayal and how playing both sides kind of requires this higher level of within group trust. So I think that's really intriguing. It's really thought-provoking. Another one of the big strengths is obviously the kind of depth of knowledge that you've gained from your field work in an area that's so difficult to access as well. And so this is obviously a really big contribution. So related to that, I would have kind of liked to see a little bit more of the evidence from your fieldwork come through in the presentation. Obviously, it's a very short presentation, but you did have a little bit of extra time. So maybe putting some kind of direct quotes in there would just help to sort of tell your story in a more powerful way. I do have some theoretical comments as well. I think some of them kind of overlap with Megan, but I'll try and focus on the things that don't. So one thing I was kind of wondering about is sources of variation between the two communities that may have been present prior to the arrival of Boko Haram. So specifically, I was wondering about the relationship between these local leaders and the state prior to the insurgency. So is it possible that the strong leaders in Guatemala, for example, were strong partly because they relied on state support, and that this has maybe created some sort of enduring loyalty that persists into the conflict period? Likewise, is the weakness of the leaders in Mate, is it that because perhaps they've already been weakened by this conflictual relationship with the central state, and this causes them to switch their loyalty to Boko Haram more quickly, basically? Alternatively, is there kind of any evidence that state coercive capacity is stronger in one region over another, and could this perhaps be shaping the relationship as well? I was also wondering about potential variation in the behavior of the rebels themselves. So is it possible that rebels are kind of more coercive in one area, or alternatively, are they offering more in terms of governance or public goods in one area as opposed to another? So, for example, I can imagine that Boko Haram might be responding to the pre-existing weaknesses of leadership in Mate by offering maybe more in terms of kind of dispute resolution, more in terms of security, something like that, which would again shape these dynamics. So could the capacity variables that you've identified also be shaping the rebels as opposed to just shaping the kind of ability of the community to respond to the rebels? Alternatively, is it possible that something Boko Haram has done in terms of rebel governance in Mate but not in Guatemala, or vice versa, that's actually weakened local capacity? So I imagine you might have kind of strong qualitative evidence to show that why this is not the case and why your mechanisms are more convincing, but it would just be great to kind of see a little bit of that in the presentation as well. And then finally, I know that you obviously focus on the community level, but I was kind of left wondering about sort of heterogeneity within communities. So how much of a community has to support Boko Haram for it to be characterized as sole compliance? Is there kind of any variation of opinion within the community? So are there kind of patterns to that variation, or is it just kind of a universally held opinion? How are you kind of assessing that level? I'm assuming like that you didn't kind of interview everyone, so like how did you kind of come to those conclusions? And then finally, I think this was mentioned by Megan, but is it possible to have a community where there's a strong leadership but low mutual accountability, and what would you expect to see in those cases as well?
All right, thank you for those comments. Everyone's being very efficient today. Jan-Dec, if you would like to take the time now for your comments.
Right, thank you very much, Buba. That was a very wonderful presentation, and and you've done a good work going to the field. As you rightly mentioned, those conflict areas are very difficult to get into. And definitely your presentation makes unique contribution. But I was just wondering, as you're talking about leadership capacity and social cohesion. So obviously you argue that the strength of leadership and level of cohesion within the communities determine the type of compliance, So, and then it might be good to define what you mean by weak leadership and strong leadership. I know you did mention bargaining power and all of that. So, and then you've also mentioned religious and traditional leaders. And then we know that in that part of Nigeria, so they don't, it's not like they change leadership frequently. So the leadership have been there, especially the religious and the traditional leaders. They've been there for a long time. It might be good to establish how you measure leadership strength, how you assess a leadership as weak and how you assess a leadership as strong. And then I'm really interested in that because it will go a long way in providing conceptual clarification to anyone who is listening and then who is obviously going to read your work. But apart from that, I think I agree with the points the two speakers that spoke earlier made. And your work definitely make a unique contribution. And I know you mentioned that this is a PhD project that is ongoing. So I can imagine some of this argument, they are still being developed. And probably the feedback you get will help enrich what you have as a final thesis. Thank you very much. That will be me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So given the time, I'm thinking that perhaps, Imrana, if you would like to take a little bit more time, since we had a lot of requests, I think, for maybe more information or clarification. So maybe do you want to take an extra 5 to 10 minutes, since you were quite efficient with your presentation, to address some of these comments, and then we can open it up to sort of further Q&A with the attendees?
Yeah, good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Megan, Tessa, Jan-Dec, thank you so much. I agree with all the comment. I mean, also because it's presentation, some of the things are there, but that comment, I think particularly about whether like the mutual accountability and the bargaining power are only like the variables that I should work with. I actually like got the same feedback, so I think maybe it's something that I should think of. The thing is that I use this theory like overall like as framing for the PhD to look at the different capacity thing, but I think I can just discard it for this paper to focus on how these two variables influence. So you are question whether like a community that has strong leadership but has weak bargaining power, what would be the outcome? I argue that that would be sole compliance, because even if the leaders negotiate with the two terms, they have the capacity to go talk to Boko Haram, to talk with state forces. The people could not keep it secret. They could not actually have this dual compliance. So ultimately, it will become sole compliance with only one at the end. And if like the leaders, they have weak bargaining power, the people, they have this strong mutual accountability, they can keep it secret, but the leaders, they don't have the bargaining power to talk to both sides. They will not even start talking to the two parties. They only talk to one party. So I argue that the sole compliance is the only outcome. So this is how I clarified in the paper, but I think maybe I need to clarify more. I also like consider a lot of all those alternative explanations. So in the paper, I put a section where I highlight them, how they do not provide a better answer. For example, regarding resistance, both like communities try to resist Boko Haram. It was after their resistance felt that they resort to this compliance. But also the nature of the resistance also relate to the capacity. So in Guzamala, where they have this strong capacity, they decide to form the militia on their own. In Malta, they could not even form the militia. It was the state force that tried to force people to join, to recruit. So they have already this weak capacity. So I look at those alternative explanations. Maybe also one thing that I think Tessa mentioned about rebel governance, those communities were not controlled by Boko Haram or state forces. They are contested communities. So they mentioned like Boko Haram will come from the forest, from their camps to get the information, to get the resources. They don't stay in the community. State forces, they have camp or in another community like 16 kilometers away, but they also don't stay. So people call them when there are attacks to come. And that is why people don't also rely on the state forces. Or they mention like, we don't like Boko Haram, we don't like them to be with us here. But if we don't like provide them with the information, the state forces will accuse us of like supporting Boko Haram. So that is the thing. Also, the key thing about the mutual accountability. So the state forces get to know about the sole compliance in Marti because the people, they could not keep the secret. The community leaders. So in Nigeria also, I know Onyedikachi know how we have these local leaders. So we have local government elected, like local government chairmen, councillors, but we also have tribal leaders, traditional leaders. So we have religious leaders. So all those compliance agreement is negotiated by them. Because Boko Haram is anti-state, most of the elected officials already like leave the conflict areas because Boko Haram will kill them. But because those traditional leaders, they are like considered like they are custodians of local culture, customs, they stay within the communities. And they are the ones that negotiate with Boko Haram. So they reach out to Boko Haram to say all those things. So that is why I focus on this local leadership, the strength and the weakness. I try to explain in the theory how they can vary, and also from the empirical evidence. For example, in Marte, they mentioned like, oh, we have these community leaders or religious leaders, but they are also very scared to talk, even at the beginning of the insurgency. They don't want to preach against Boko Haram because they are afraid that they will be attacked. In Guzamala, they mentioned like, oh, the leaders were already like very like outspoken. They tried like to discourage young people from joining the insurgent, and they have this link with the state forces. So I try to link it, but I think maybe it's very important to still. I also discussed the longer alternative explanation in the appendix to explain in more detail that Boko Haram is not in control of one of the communities. Also, I provide additional evidence that is not only limited to the two communities I mentioned. This is phenomenon that is happening in many like conflict contexts, even ongoing. But also there is a lot of also ethics. If I mention all the communities that this is something that is happening, I may end up endangering the communities. Imagine state forces don't know that like this community secretly talk with Boko Haram, and I mentioned their names in the article, everything. So I mentioned like I only focus on communities that the situation is already public. The state forces have as either like forced them to relocate from the communities they know about the compliance, or they already like something that is already reported in the media or something, so that like I don't end up like endangering them by saying all the things they have been doing. But I really appreciate the comment. I think it helps me to think a lot. Especially about this mutual accountability and bargaining power. Maybe they can just be my variables that I don't really need that collective action capacity after all. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up now to the room, as it were. And anyone who wants to jump in, anyone has a question or a comment, just raise your hand and I'll call you on. Yeah? Yes, Rona.
I was just wondering, what do you think is going to be the most challenging part of your research now that you've already undertaken some of the field work? So I was just curious as to what you think is going to be the most challenging part of your research moving forward.
Okay, great, thank you. If anyone else has any more questions, we can collect some. And why don't we just start with Rona's question, Imrana, if you would like to.
Yeah. I mean, the challenging part is actually what I've been doing now. I mean, trying to like explain the whole research output like better, because like you get feedback, people push you toward different direction, and I think sometimes this is the beauty of like the abduction approach. So I rely a lot on the fieldwork data that I've got, but also there are a lot of theories out there that maybe already explain some of the issues I'm trying to clarify or provide more clarity. For example, why people can do this instead of this. So it's still trying to connect with this literature. People mention, oh, there is this study that I think maybe you can look at that mentions similar thing. So I've been doing this, so I think this is something I've been doing. But I also already like start to build on this work. So I have another work that I look at how the nature of the compliance also shape the nature of the insurgent control. So I look at where people have this dual compliance. How would the insurgent like be able to have like control compared to where there is this sole compliance? Some of the research agenda that I identify in this paper, and I think the more I also start to work, the more I start to look at, oh, this is something that maybe can generate like a lot of insight in how like the nature of the compliance also shape other aspect of civil war. Yeah, but I think the most difficult part is trying to also address those comments. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question or a comment? Sorry, Megan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, if I can, I was just going to follow up on some of the comments Imrana made. So as you were talking, and this actually builds off of Tessa's point about where do some of these, like, where do you see, what are the underlying conditions that bring about strong leaders or high levels of accountability? I was trying to think about a situation in which there was high community accountability, but then weak leadership. I don't understand why the rebels or the state wouldn't just try and work with the community in and of themselves. Like why not try and find community leaders who seem or maybe outside of more traditional authority structures? Like, are there processes or are there other people who you might reach out to if those community members seem to have like high levels of at least social coordination amongst one another and accountability? And so I wondered if, can you think of cases in which you have high accountability but low bargaining power, or vice versa? Or do these two variables actually move together? And so if they actually are connected and move together, then it suggests that there might be something else going on there. But I would, like, if they're actually two different variables, then they need to move separately from one another. And so that was just something that kind of I was curious about. I don't know that this is in my context, but just something to consider as you move forward.
Yeah. I never think of it this way, but I think it's a good way to think, especially like maybe there may be individuals that the insurgent can rely on, not necessarily like the community level compliance. I discuss, I think, in the paper that the insurgent can have also individual level compliance outside this collective compliance. It's likely some individuals who reach out to insurgent to negotiate their individual self-protection or even to support them. I cited, I think, literature that show up to 5% of population are likely to support insurgent, to have sympathy with their goals, everything. But I never think of it that the insurgent can actually sometimes even prefer to reach out to those people when the community leaders don't have the bargaining power thing. I think this is something that I should think of. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments? Well, I was mostly going to say what Megan then said, because I was having a hard time disentangling what the situation would be with the sort of weak leadership but sort of a strong community, or vice versa. So I think she put that very well. But going back to that idea, if we take that idea further and we imagine that rebels may reach out to individuals, could you imagine a situation where you effectively have sort of dual compliance, in that there are groups or individuals within the same community in which some are supporting the state and some are supporting rebels, so that you don't actually have conditions of either potentially either strong leadership or very, mutual accountability. You have individual compliance happening, but within the same community.
Yeah, so in my argument, I argue like the sole compliance is more risky because the state forces are likely to know if you comply with only the insurgent. So in a way, I was showing like, oh, there is actually unintended consequence when you engage in this sole compliance. So if the communities, they have also this weak mutual accountability, some people may report to the state forces. Some people may even report to the insurgent, or this committee is only talking with the state forces, or they don't want to talk to you. So it's like the action of the people can spoil that like sole compliance. That is why also the other parties will know and they will experience violence. And if they engage in the dual compliance, if there is this strong mutual accountability, people will keep it secret in a way that none of the parties will know. So I argue that provides a kind of more protection compared to the sole compliance. In the literature, I think what people think is that talking to both sides is more risky because it can put you like at risk. It's better you just identify strong party and align with them. My argument is that is also risky in a contested environment because the other party will likely attack you. So in a way, I was arguing if you can do it safely, if you can do the dual compliance safely when you have this capacity, it can provide better protection. The thing is about the long-term trajectory of it, because the conflict environment change. What if one of the actors eventually discover that you are talking to both sides? Would that also mean they will face violence from both sides? The state forces will attack them, and then the insurgent will attack them, or what will happen? So this is something that is not explored in the paper about the long-term trajectory of the dual compliance. But this is what I've been thinking about the role of the mutual accountability.
Well, we have about 5 more minutes, so if anyone else wants to ask any more questions or request any more information or maybe provide some thoughts or feedback.
Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. And I think you are absolutely right. A lot of things you discussed is also applicable to different other jurisdictions, including current Afghanistan, at some point West Bengal, and the conflict between Tamils and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. I think a lot of things and patterns are very much the framework which you are developing is very useful for understanding what's happening there. I have a question very much similar to what Megan's, and that is about the conceptualization of compliance. I mean, I can understand, the way you are categorizing is sole compliance and the dual compliance, and it is quite actors-oriented conceptualization. But did you consider? I mean, I'm just wondering. It's possible in the full paper or thesis somewhere you might have considered the process-oriented compliance. Like compliance could be partial compliance, could be full compliance. It could be a step taken towards the goal and ideology or aims and objectives of that person, particular leader or the organization, or it could be a series of steps taken towards. And if it's necessary for those actions taken by the community to be successful or the unsuccessful. So I was just wondering if you consider the process-oriented conceptualization of concept, because that also is related to, that affects the idea of strong and weak leadership, because once that is clarified, then you can also easily clarify who is strong leader and who is weak leader, because when it comes to the strong leadership, then the compliance is usually very full. And I think that's very much applicable to the current Afghanistan's regime, no matter what media, international media is portraying. But I think community compliance is very high, and I think I would be very careful to categorize that level of compliance as partial compliance. It's kind of a full compliance, and I think that's why it's very much sustainable and the leadership is strong with with the exception of, the internal conflicts which are reported in media here and there. Yeah, that's the comments I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I need to think a lot about this. So the way I conceptualize compliance now, I consider it like a kind of tacit-like agreement. It doesn't have to be written. In both the cases, they don't have written agreement with the Boko Haram insurgent. It's more of handshake agreement. Don't do this, and then I will do this for you. And then if you do this, this is the consequence. It's more of a kind of verbal exchange and then handshake. Oh, this happened, and then reinforcement time to time. They come to remind them, this is what we agreed. You should not do this. So I consider like the compliance compared to the existing terms like civilian support, civilian collaboration, civilian cooperation. I consider the compliance as having less engagement. Like, first, they don't require the civilians like to participate in their military activities. So the compliance does not involve forming the self-defense militia, does not involve like people to be Boko Haram members to go to Boko Haram camps. No, it just requires information, especially. Tell us if the military is approaching, or tell us like when you want to travel or something. And then give us resources, especially for the insurgent. They also ask resources sometimes, ask money, ask food, but there is no involvement. And I explained in the theory why armed actors will even allow this, because if they have the power to force the communities to do something, they can decide to say, you must give me full support, join me to fight the government. But I explained that that is not the case, because if they force the communities that are not sympathetic to their goals to fully join, they will displace. And if they displace the community, they deny them resources and the information, everything they can get. So insurgents sometimes can tolerate this kind of compliance. It's low level compared to support. It's low level compared to collaboration. But I explained like they can consider it valuable. So in the other paper, I was looking at how in the long term, maybe that can force them to change it. So for example, if the community keep providing information, keep providing resources, and the insurgent becomes stronger, they will become like powerful, that they will make them to change it maybe to full support, that we no longer want information, we want you to take weapon to fight for us. So this may be another, I think in a different paper, I look at how maybe making payment can make militia in a communal conflict context to become coercive toward the insurgent that was empowering them. So maybe in the context of the civil war, it can also become another unintended consequence. We pay you and then you become stronger and you become another threat. But in this paper, I did not look in detail about the long-term impact. But I really need to think a lot about the concept again.
All right, well, thank you. And on that note, I think we'll finish for today. So I'd just like to thank you, Imrana, for a very insightful presentation to your doctoral project. Seems like a great contribution to the wider literature on civil wars. Many thanks to Dr. Stewart, Dr. Devereaux, and Mr. Onyedikachi for useful comments, and to everyone who's attended the session. I would just like to remind everyone, the GlobalSouth Network warmly welcomes PhD students from any discipline in any part of the world to share their projects and receive interdisciplinary feedback. Anyone interested in presenting their work or participating in the session can contact Dr. Noman Reyes, the founder and convener of the GlobalSouth Network, at the email address provided in the chat box. So same time next week, let's meet our next guest speaker, Tiffany Adams, who's a PhD candidate at the School of Law, the Open University, who will be presenting a project titled The Efficacy of Emergency Procurement Legislation in Jamaica, next Wednesday, 30th of April, 2025, from 3 to 4. So take care, look after yourselves, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Thank you.
Bye.
Mm.
Thank you.